Today I'm talking to Professor Zhang Zhang. He's known to his UK colleagues as Joshua, which is what I'll be calling him during this podcast. He's director of the Centre for Chinese and Visual Arts at Birmingham City University and head of research at the School of Art. He has extensive research and curatorial experience in contemporary and visual arts. He was lead curator for the Guangzhou Triennial in 2012, the Asia Triennial in Manchester in 2014, and most recently, lead curator for the first Thailand Biennale in 2019. On top of all these other achievements, he was also impact lead for his school's submission to the UK's REF 2021, which is the national benchmarking exercise for research that is undertaken every 6 to 7 years in the UK. So, welcome Joshua, and thank you for taking the time to speak to me today.
Thank you, Saskia, for having me.
That's all right. I'm looking forward to our discussion, actually. So Joshua and I have worked together over the last couple of years, working on his REF impact case study at Birmingham City University. But Joshua, let's go back to basics. You are a practice-led researcher, which is a term that's used a lot in the arts. Can you explain what that means and particularly how it relates to your practice?
Yeah, this term has been used quite a lot in terms of practice-led or practice-based. But in my view, researcher is a researcher. Either it's female or male, practice-led or theoretical, it's a researcher. But it is important as a reminder that, that practice is not necessarily research, and research doesn't have to include practice in many ways. And I've been working in School of Art, and I've been discussing with a range of colleagues who are practicing artists or curators. Sometimes that we don't come to an agreement in terms of what is research and what is practice. So it is important to have that term in order to narrow down the research that we are talking about.
Okay.
So for me, I would say I research as a curator and I curate as a researcher.
Okay, that's very neat. Expand on how that manifests itself in how you approach a show then.
Yeah, I think, basically I work in the university and I've got loads of opportunities to work externally and internationally with colleagues, with museum professionals and artists in particular. In the context of research practice itself, I think curating to me is an indispensable research methods to carry out my research and make my research meaningful in many ways. First of all, we all understand that curating is a useful tool to produce output, for instance, making a show. That's I guess that a lot of people can understand this. At the same time, curating is an important process for research as well, including obtaining first-hand material, generating discussions with artists, and also the new understanding between the parties, and also curating, I see it as an evaluative platform for research as well. So it's not just we know where we are going, and then curating is a way of production. But more than that, it's more discursive in a way to find the effective method in order to achieve the research objectives.
So it's part of the reflexive process the actual act of curating as part of your research. Okay,
Yeah.
so that's quite interesting. What the way that you've described the two elements together, and I think when you're talking about the arts, you are talking about very much the coexistence of research practice and very close together. How does that very tight relationship between the two have an effect on how you think about research impact?
Right. I think it's, in terms of the curating as a research practice, I think it's slightly easier for us to think about impact than, say, writing a book, for instance. And because we are making shows, and the show is in a public domain, and it will generate some form of impact anyway, big or small. But a lot of general understanding will say, okay, the impact of a show, we're talking about the number of audience, for instance, and the regular report from the news and so on. But I think the impact that we are talking about is more than that. I think the number of audience, they are important, but they are not critical in terms of assessing the research impact. And I think the news report can be useful, but again, it's not vital in terms of the impact that we are looking at. I mean, generally speaking, when we're talking about this side of the thing, that we are actually talking about a post-exhibition impact. After the exhibition, what happens? Where the impacts lie? But I think there's also equally important part of it is the pre-exhibition period, where our research can change the way of thinking of, let's say, policymakers, or let's say curatorial approaches within a certain art organization, for example. These impact actually started to be generated before the exhibition taking place. So, I mean, in general, we can talk about pre-exhibition impact and post-exhibition impact. So for the pre-exhibition impact, we're talking about changing strategies, curatorial approaches of an organization or art organizations, and also the way in which that our research can influence the cultural policies and the change of the cultural policies. For example, a certain government decided to make a more international show, for instance, and these are all dependent the originality and the rigor of our research, and how our research can be so persuasive to change the current or the original way of their thinking. And also, when we're talking about the post-exhibition, as I said, that it's not critical in terms of the number of attendance of audience, but more importantly, I think from this impact case study exercise, I learned that the change of the perception of the audience are more important, and also generating something really interdisciplinary or cross-cultural for them to understand, in my case, contemporary art differently. I think that's more important.
Thank you for explaining that, and it's really been fascinating for me listening to you, because, as I mentioned, you and I have worked together for a few years now, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong in saying this, I think that your understanding of impact has changed and matured over that period of time. So I think to some people listening to this podcast, what you've just described, which is almost about sort of a much wider concept of impact than you might be used to in the arts. A lot of arts, when people, and often people in the arts, when they think about impact, it's tied to maybe the sort of reports they have to give back to funders, which often asks for those sort of things, such as numbers and things that you can monitor easily. So I guess my question to you is, bearing in mind that someone listening to this may not necessarily have thought about impact in the way that you've just described, what would you say are, how do you go about even assessing, gathering impact in that way? What were the sort of challenges that you encountered based on sort of, the journey that you've just gone through over the last few years, and how did you overcome them?
There are different cultural practice in different countries and regions. And I think this is quite a challenge to me. It's, on the one hand, I feel privileged in working with colleagues internationally. But for some country and in some culture, for example, the news report, they don't collect them, and the problem is that, for example, I worked with Thailand for a long time. I don't read Thai at all, so it's I have to rely on colleagues' responses and their assistance to help me to collect those evidence, collect those important materials as part of the impact case study. And also in the other country, let's say, the country that I worked most is China. And you will see hundreds of reports of one show, but the problem is that they are more or less the same. They just, that's the way that they operate. And for example, a more authoritative news saying the work and the exhibition is good in a certain way, and then those smaller media will follow that, and more or less the same, if not just copy and paste. So therefore, it's not to me, it's not the number of the report. I'm always fascinated about the similarity between the reports, but also some report will be standing out very obviously, which can be really critical about your exhibition or about a particular piece of art. That's where we start to learn, where's the problem and how can we make this better in the future. But coming back to your question in terms of gathering those materials, and I think there are always different ways to make this happen. And we do need some local assistance for us to achieve those objectives.
Yeah, and I suppose it's also having those conversations with people to explore what those, as you termed them, I think quite nicely, those sort of pre-exhibition impacts are, because it's not necessarily obvious to you as the researcher, what is changing and how mindsets are changing necessarily. There is a job in terms of going back and delving into that. And I think that's where it can be quite challenging if you are the researcher, to go back and delve into it, or even to be able to sort of think about it sort of in that way. So reflecting a little bit, I think, on your role as heading up impact, so you have an overview of the other impact case studies. How looking at those, what are your reflections there on the challenges for impact in the arts, not just, you know, because not everyone, not all the case studies are sort of, you know, in roles similar to yours where it's about curation. So can I ask you to reflect a little bit on what you've learned looking across your experiences with the case studies that you have worked with? Was thinking about the different types of impact that have been achieved across the School of Art and you've attempted to capture in different case studies. I think those case studies have all had different challenges as part of it, and thinking about it in that sort of pre and post exhibition way. What have you seen, you know, have you observed similarities across the different types of arts case studies, or do you think actually the challenges are quite distinct?
Yeah, I would have to say that each impact case study is unique in their own way. It will be quite difficult to generalize them to say, okay, this is the challenge and that is the challenge. I mean, from my experience that obviously in order to persuade people for the pre-exhibition, for example, the impact case study, obviously you need some innovative research to set the ground for the persuasion, and you need a little bit of charm and luck, you know, and patience. Always be patient. And I think for our colleagues in at School of Art and in other schools in the faculty, practice-led research is always interesting in terms of generating impact. And I think it has been such a challenge and pleasure at the same time to be involved in the peer review process of the impact case study. In this way, I can learn from colleagues, how do they identify and articulate their impact. And it's important. I see that as an outsider, actually. So I know very little about music, for instance. I know very little about performance art, for instance. And when I read this, I have some basic understanding about research methods, for instance, and how research project can be conducted. But at the same time, I came in as an ordinary audience, and I'm one of those that they expect to have the impact on. So if I can't understand that, the impact case study won't go too far, I guess. Yeah. So that's the way in which that we peer review between each other. And I think Saskia yourself has been leading all this, and it's such an interesting exercise for many of us.
Yeah, and I think it is an interesting exercise to be able to look across this very wide range of disciplines that we collectively call the arts, because within each of those, as you very correctly identify, each case study is unique. That's what makes it so hard doing something like a toolkit for impact, because you can give lots of generalizations about this area or that area, but when it comes down to your particular piece of research and the impact that's been generated from that, and how you articulate it, how you identify it, it will be unique to that body of work and what's happened as a result of it. And I think the point that you've just made there, whereas you know, across this sort of broad range of disciplines that is you know, the arts, there's loads of different forms of research, and out of that, different types of impact that need to be articulated in quite different ways. And in some respects, if we take your work as a curator of an exhibition and then we look at music, in some respects, it's a similar thing, whereas music produces something and then it goes out into the world. In the same way you create an exhibition, it goes out into the world, and it's then how is that perceived and understood by the people? What effect does it have on them? And that process of capturing the effect is the bit that is the sort of the challenge in the arts. How do you capture, because I remember you and I having a conversation about, well, how do I capture the effect of the Thailand Biennale when all of the art pieces are outside, some of them on remote islands with tourists? How do we try and capture that? I don't think we gained an answer to that one in the end, but we found ways around it, such as trying to capture newspaper reports or trying to gather information from the Department of Tourism, etc. So there are so many different types of impact, and I think it's interesting that, you know, having been involved in that process as you have, you're able to see that across the piece. And do you think that would be beneficial to you in how you, you know, going forward, thinking about the impact of your research?
Absolutely. I think this is not only beneficial for me to think about the future impact case study, but also important for me and for every single researchers to think about their own research per se. The reason being is that we all doing research, we write books, we make exhibitions, we create artworks as research. But is there anyone care? You know, this is the key question. And I think this is why I found this impact history exercise so valuable for all researchers. It's not just for, let's say in the UK REF exercise. It's not only that, but it's instrumental for us to think about the functionality, the use of the research. You know, why do we do research other than making a book to be left on the dusty shelf? No, I think the exhibition. Let's come back to the exhibition scenario again. When people make an exhibition, there are many curators, many artists. You make a piece of art, you make an exhibition. They can be brilliant artwork, they can be brilliant exhibition, but they are not necessarily research. And even if you are writing a book is not necessarily research, because you don't, you know, create original contribution to knowledge, for instance, and you don't have the rigor of your research methods. But for this research impact, it is an important opportunity for us to evaluate our contribution to the real world, you know, beyond the academia. Rather than having a few citations out of your book, what does your research really do to this work? So I think impact study to me is like, we all know that before your research that you need to identify, let's say, a gap or a need in the academic market. You know, you find out the gap in the field of the scholarship, and then you position your research in the research context, and then you make sure that you are doing something original. But research impact study is a step up, in addition to say, okay, so your research is really original, but it can be, you know, wrapped up only in the university. Can it survive when you pull it out from the university, from out of the library to the real world? What is the sustainability and what is the legacy of your research, rather than just a book on the shelf, rather than just a catalog, as I call it, a ruin of the exhibition. You know, it's dead basically. But the ruin, the dead body of the exhibition is important. But other than that, have you changed anything? I think this is how research impact inspires me. You know, in the end of the day, we are actually talking about the relationship between our research and everyday life.
Couldn't agree more, Joshua. It is, I often, and in fact, I think in one of the earlier episodes of this toolkit, one of the things I say is that for me, impact is essentially, when you get down to it, the reason you're probably doing research, because you want to do and create something that somebody somewhere has an effect on somebody somewhere in a positive way. And, you know, that is the motivator for what that's about. I wanted to bring you back to something that you said earlier, actually, where you were talking about the sort of the elements that one needs when approaching impact, and how it might be sort of created or generated. And I think you said you needed a mixture of innovative research, some charm, some luck, and lots of patience, which I think is a nice recipe. Just explore that. Let me explore that a little bit with you, and just to sort of say, you know, what have you based that on? What do you mean? What experience are you drawing on to pull together those elements?
There's a number of occasions. I curated many exhibitions, but some exhibitions is not something that one person or two person can decide. For example, a biennale or triennale, and it's also not a case like, you know, you submit an external funding application and you're waiting for some feedback, for some result, let's say from HRC or British Academy, but nowadays they don't even give you feedbacks either, so that wasn't very helpful. But for the exhibition application, it's a strange world, actually. I was invited once, and I was applying once, very different experience. And when you write the proposal that you need to discuss with people, one thing actually is very important is that you're trying to demonstrate how different that your research is with the existing world. But again, this is a quite Western-centric thought about, okay, this is new knowledge, this is innovative, and therefore you need to take it. But in a very different cultural and political contexts, people don't necessarily think about this way. So you for example, in let's say in South Korea, in China, you really need to understand the culture and their politics in order to sell your research in a very different way, actually. It's not, they don't really care that you using appropriate research methods to answer all those research questions. That's my experience. But on the other hand, they do value, obviously, the innovation of your project and how new is this. But again, these can be interpreted in a very different way, in their language. I mean, I can speak Chinese, that's my native language, but I'm completely lost my control when I talking to the Minister of Culture in Thailand, when somebody, my capable assistant translating my my proposal in Thai, and I have no idea whether the translation is accurate or not. So I'm completely, it's like sitting on the fly, you know, when you have some turbulence, you just leave it, you know, you can't do anything about it. But it's an interesting adventure. And I think research is a form of adventure.
I think you raise a good point there about, you know, the cultural differences. And it is, it is worth remembering that, you know, we can look at this whole idea of what's the impact of your research, which is driven by, you know, if the critiques of it is a very sort of a neoliberal sort of cultural approach to accountability, is quite Western centric, and asking researchers who might be working with artists from all over the world or different practitioners from all over the world, the kind of questions that you have to ask to gather some of that, to get that sense of what the impact might be over and above the obvious, can be, you know, can be challenging and can be difficult. And you have to tread carefully. You have to tread with cultural sensitivity, and to do it, you know, with patience, as you said, you know, to do that in a patient way. And I think there is patience involved in the world of thinking about research impact, because so much of it is about time. You know, you and I have discussed this in the past, and I discuss it with lots of other people, that time is such an important part of being able to identify what that impact is, because it takes time to filter through, to digest, to mature, to sort of become what it might be. So thinking a little bit about time, if you had some words of wisdom for a younger, you know, some early career researchers in a similar discipline to yourself, or even some advice to the younger you in relation to thinking about impact and some of those demands, what might it be? I put you on the spot there a little.
Yeah, thanks very much, Saskia. And I will return to my earlier thought, which is the relationship between research and everyday life. And I think research impact cannot be separated away from research itself anyway, because they are so connected between each other. And a valuable piece of research, a significant research, will automatically have impact. And important impact from research, that must be a sort of important project within the research practice. I mean, it's within the art practice as well as the design and music everywhere. And I think for the young researchers, I think you're right. We need to be a little patient. That needs some time to grow. Not only the research impact, but also charm of research. But I think it's as long as we stick with our passion for the research, and we keep being curious in a way, then we will step out from the academia to our real world.
I couldn't agree more, Joshua. I think absolutely that is a lovely way to end our podcast. I have enjoyed talking with you. Thank you very much for sharing your insights.